Well, hello. These are my notes for week 7. The idea of this week is to continue to level our gaze at a specific form of literary theory, expanding our basis for understanding it. We have so far devoted this special focus to the psychoanalytical and feminist criticism, and this week we look deeper into Marxist theory. Let me start off by saying that there are some challenging readings included this week. Like our readings last week, much of what we have to look at is rather oriented towards the theoretical than the literary specifically. Regardless, it should really give you some good, fresh thoughts on Marxism. We start off, as we always do, with our editors, Rivkin and Ryan, and their remarks in starting with 0. As usual, they do a good job on their own. As we've seen previously, Rivkin and Ryan inform us that there are multiple ways of using Marxism. They all stem from a single proposition, that literature is political. And that's a good place to start. So let me ask, do you think literature can primarily be described as political? We have a long tradition traceable back to the Romantic period. And it asks us to understand the aesthetic as a way of knowing the truth about life. Inherent in this view is that the squalid materiality that we live in, the domain of the political, is not the whole story, not, in fact, the truth of who we are. It's a Platonic viewpoint where we're encouraged to think of the truths found in great art as something pure and distinct from the lives we live. And that's just a pale reflection of the distillation art can provide. So invariably, this kind of thinking establishes a kind of hierarchy where the elite are enlightened and educated to comprehend these poetic truths, while the less than elite work the factories and fields and are generally regarded as not having a capacity for understanding the realities of the higher ideas of life. Superficially, to us in modern times, this sounds ridiculous, but it still holds a weird sway with us. I know that when I think of a book, I feel the pull to say that a good book is a thing of beauty, that it is something more than just an object. However, experience has taught me that human interaction is ruled by agendas driven by ideology, and this includes interaction through the written word. So I recognize that a good book is a thing of beauty, but it is also a political expression, and in some ways, it's more beautiful for that. Rivkin and Ryan talk about the main ways that Marxism appears in criticism. Because Marx talked about history, Marxist theory can look at a piece of literature as a reflection of the cultural history that produced it. So, by reading literature, we can divine the society that produced it. Another way of looking at this is that when we want to know a people, we can do so by reading their literature. Literature can also be said to have an active role in our relationship to culture. When an author sees something they do not like going on around them, they can write a book to help convince people to change it. This change might promote altering basic tenets that the population embraces. Alternately, the literature produced may include a conservative agenda that promotes tradition over progress. Our editors outline 2 varieties of Marxist criticism that have been popular in Britain, where, because of the politics of the 20th century, most prominent critics of this type originated at that time. One type favors the connection between history and literature. Basically, they say that if history is the story of economics, then literature is an expression of this economic history. The second type of British Marxist criticism focuses on cultural materialism, a viewpoint built on the dialectic nature of power. While the dominant segments of society write the history that we subsequently read, often ignoring subaltern groups, the omissions, those that they do not write about, speak volumes to us as we look back. In the last segment of the overview, Rivkin and Ryan provide a look at new historicism. This is not particularly pertinent for our studies, but it does provide some good context about lenses which really focus on history. My first takeaway from this synopsis of New Historicism is that it looks at history as a deconstructionist looks at a text. My second takeaway is that this view of history can easily be conjoined with any other lens with a specific social agenda, like feminism. For our purposes, this shift from Marxism to historicism should be looked at as a continuum where the subject remains constant, since Marxism starts with history and attempts to project where it goes from there. So, our first reading is from Bakhtin. Bakhtin, his reflections in Discourse in the novel, talk about language. And I think probably, if you're reading this for the first time, which I'm guessing you are, that you kind of, when you get into it, you're not sure where this is going to go in relation to Marxism because it seems very general to start with. But I assure you, since Bakhtin resided in the Soviet Union and his lifetime coincided with its existence, his writings definitely met the rigorous standards of an officially Marxist press. So this excerpt definitely gets there gets to Marxism eventually. The thesis for this piece is that the novel represents social interaction. People engaged in performing social action within the novel are identified through words, frequently their own words. As we read, differing sets of words stand in for the place of different people. Bakhtin suggests that this action of the novel works because it parallels our experience in our everyday lives. So he makes several points. The first is, he notes that the language in your mouth is unique to you, just as the language in your ears is unique to those talking to you. Everyone has a unique history, and this is demonstrated in their unique language. Essentially, this means that your unique language represents your personal ideology as shaped by your experiences. Overt ideology, in the political sense, can enter into this as well, as we pick and choose how to represent ourselves according to precepts we encounter and assume are right. Next, Bakhtin talks about literary language, and he says it is likewise individualized, but it is also codified and structured differently than real language. Genre is a big determinant in this structure, stressing the agenda included within the narrative. But even this does not stop individuation of language as writers inject themselves into what they're saying. What binds all the varying uses of language together is a single overriding function. Language is used to talk about our binding materiality and to negotiate the meaning of the material with one another. Not coincidentally, this is also what the novel does. All right. So in American literature in the 20th century, one of the major writers, sorry, her name escaped me for a moment, was Eudora Welty. Eudora Welty had a lot to say about what place does for story. All right. And this is really essentially parallels what Bakhtin is talking about. We can't have a story without it being set in a certain place. And even if it's, and again, we'll see some, I think next week we'll read a story by Borgia, and it is a very amorphous place, but it's still a place. It's almost impossible to have a story without it being set somewhere, without it being materially fixed in a location, and have material stuff going on. You can't just have a disembodied voice coming from nowhere and that be a story. So that's really what we're talking about with materiality being essential to what we're doing. We're always talking about things, and the things are being represented in language, whether it's just a casual conversation or whether it's a story that you're reading, whether it's a novel. So, with all that in mind, Bakhtin comments on how we are facile in the way we use language, constantly shifting our language to meet the needs of whatever group we happen to be engaging with. At some point, we reach a level of meta awareness about this act and consider shaping how we present ourselves. And when this happens, we find ourselves asking the question, who is the real us? This entails the active development of a personal ideology. When this occurs, it means that we begin to pick and choose what words we will allow to come out of our mouths because we know that others will think of us in a certain way when they hear them. To others, our existence will be determined by the quality and subject of what they hear from us, and we will do the same with everyone else. The result is that who we are has an awful lot to do with what we say, and what we say is to a large degree learned. When we build our ideology, it is rarely, if ever, done through original thought, but by applying our judgment to what we have heard from others and adopting that which seems virtuous as our own. So we talk the talk of others, linking our ideology with theirs. Two elements can influence the building of ideology. One is authority, and this is a language that is self-supporting, that needs no evidence to convince. Authority speaks, and we recognize it and obey. The second is persuasion. Persuasion is language that is not self-supporting, but it includes evidence that will attempt to convince. However, the primary role of persuasion is engagement. Its function is fulfilled when the listener continues the argument even after it is over. This is all part of the development of the individual through language, and the novel represents the same processes. In particular, the constant speaking of multiple voices, multiple perspectives, repeating and judging the words of others. Now, I know these are a lot of, large abstract thoughts that develop broad views about the way we inhabit our world and the way we inhabit literature. But I think you will find them consistent with what we've already learned about ideology, now put in a very specific context within the literary. At the same time, Bakhtin makes moves to consider real life in the same vein, as a story which is being told. We move next to Walter Benjamin and Theses on the Philosophy of History. And I have to tell you, I know I don't look it, but I am so happy to be sharing this work of Walter Benjamin with you. I know that I have occasionally thrown around the word favorite critic in my notes, but without reservation, Benjamin is by far, for real, my favorite critic, and I adore Theses on the Philosophy of History. I know for a fact that part of my attachment to Benjamin is a ridiculous romanticism about the end of his life. Leaving Germany with the rise of National Socialist power in 1932, he resided and worked in Spain and France until the start of World War II. When the Germans invaded France, Benjamin attempted to flee to neutral Portugal, but encountered difficulties. Fearing he would be returned to Nazi-controlled France, Benjamin took his own life. Prior to fleeing, one of the personal documents he sent along with the clay painting Angelus Novus, mentioned in Thesis 9, to his friend Hannah Arendt was this insane piece of criticism. It's hard to know what to think of it. When we studied Adrienne Rich, I suggested her poem, Diving into the Wreck, says as much about her viewpoint as her criticism. And I feel like Theses on the Philosophy of History is kind of a critical poem. Just to let you know, it's nothing like his regular criticism, which is always brilliant, focused, and breathtaking, but, conventional. One that you're likely to encounter is The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction from 1936. It's an early reflection on the place that film had come into shaping and reflecting culture. So what I'm going to do is simply walk through this thesis by thesis. 1. And these are just my interpretations of what's going on. As I said, to me it's very poetic, so you're welcome to interpret it in different ways. I know I mentioned this work in my dissertation defense, and I had a one of my committee who totally disagreed with my reading of it, and we sat and argued for a good portion of the time about what Benjamin really meant. We're just going to walk through these. And as I say, one by one, I'll just tell you what I think is going on in each of them. 1. Marxism can succeed, but the Marxism marketed to people uses non-Marxist means to do that winning. The chess game that serves as the metaphor in this focuses on the future in mapping moves, but Marxism is about the past. It's about history. 2. We are disconnected from the future. It is an abstract to us. In contrast, we are very connected to the past and feel ourselves master of it because we can know it. 3. History is not about large versus small events, but it seems that way. This seeming is an indication of how we have been corrupted by pre-existing conceptions of history, power, and our relationships to these. 4. Comprehension of history is always colored by that history and events which intervene between moments in time. Materiality is gained through struggle, but the real gain is the ability to shift meanings in history. 5. We interpret the past according to our own prejudices. We dismiss as unimportant what we have been taught not to prioritize. 6. Our history is impacted by the whole story of the past. Our history, seen from the future, is the story of us all, not just the select few. 7, and I start this one with a quote. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. When we tell stories of the past, we tend to point to positive development, a march of progress. However, enlightenment cannot exist without there having been an unenlightened time to distinguish it. So, do not forget those times or the people who lived them. 8. The sense of progress, of positive change, can have dire negative impacts on our consideration of the present, our willingness to act. 9. Angelus Novus, the clay painting, looks backward, never forward, but it must always move in the direction it cannot see, towards its future. It looks backward and sees history as a cloud of violence and waste. So it begs the question, what does this angel, looking backward, think it is moving towards? 10. Modern politicians ignore the past, recharacterizing the violence and waste as a trend towards betterment. This leaves them unwilling to proactively seek to wrestle with the past and make something good come of it. Instead, they expect it to simply come. 11. Practically, we see the fantasy of the American dream promoted, the message that if you work hard, you will succeed. However, this message ignores the way that the system is gamed against the worker. For people to base policies on ideas which are simply fantasy is as dishonest as it is ignorant. 12. Politicians turn the eyes of the worker toward the future, to the time when the American dream will come to pass. This makes the worker ignore the truth which resides within their own bodies, the history of workers who breed other workers and die poor. 13. Progress, as a concept, is divorced from history. It exists apart in a hypothetical space, the future, where anything can happen. 14. History tells us that things don't just happen. The present is built upon the past. 15. Revolution is a moment when the past comes to a head in the present and time ceases to move forward. People attempt to reshape what they know in a positive light to make a future, not just let it happen. 16. All of the history can be seen as moments of such revolution where people were attempting to shape the future, the one we now inhabit. 17. History is therefore about these moments. Individuals who exist in what to them is the present do the one thing they can to try to move forward. We are the result of that movement. 18. The present is but a moment, and it all depends on the past. And he has two ancillary ideas. We see things in terms of cause and effect, but this is only done in reflection. In the present, when a cause occurs, no one knows what it will bring. The historian should look at causes in the same way the present does. And secondly, cultural cues can add weight to the arguments about history. Jews were forbidden to engage in forecasting the future, but they were instructed in many ways to commemorate the past. Remembering the past does not cut them off from the future. Rather, it ensures that they are prepared for the salvation which the future brings. So, what we have is a very succinct meditation on the nature of history and materialism. And this is the heart of Marxism. And Benjamin puts it together in this totally, I think, just insane way. Call it messianic criticism, call it poetic criticism. I know I love it. And we move to our last reading from Michel Foucault. We read from The Right of Death and Power Over Life. Foucault is interested in how the modern state develops power over individuals. A large portion of his work looks at observable shifts between how people perceive their lives when moving from a feudal economy to a capitalist one. While not really a Marxist, Foucault was a personal friend of Althusser, and since he was a historian by training, we can pair him with the Marxists without too much stretching. Foucault's specialization in history was what we refer to as the early modern era in literature, which is to say, sometime around the 17th century when the Renaissance was a thing of the past and modern states were in the process of forming in Europe. What he's interested in is in how these early states exercised power. For the average person in, say, France in the year 1650, law would be administered in three ways: through civil courts, church courts, and the imposition of moral law by local church representation. In feudal Europe, as I'm sure you know, both the church and the state had the ability to prosecute and punish offenders, and the struggle to establish a hierarchy between their various courts represents a good deal of, the history as we teach it. Between canonical and civil law, Foucault also includes what he calls the Christian pastoral as another area of enforcement. And what he means by Christian pastoral is simply the presence and participation of individuals in communities with their local priest, in particular through the sacrament of confession. This may seem a kind of an odd inclusion, but Foucault suggests that the usage of the practice introduced a common sense within the community that ills and transgressions would out, whether they were addressed by official legal sanction or not. If you feel like this is the case, then you are encouraged to control such ills and transgressions by your own volition, so that you become the first line of defense against breaches of order. By policing yourself, you then become, essentially, an agent of the law, and thus an agent of those in power over you. As Europe transitioned with power shifting exclusively to secular hands, this brand of enforcement fell away from its role with the law. So Foucault looks for ways that secular governments and their societal extensions attempted to replicate systems of self-policing. The start of our excerpt, which is actually the closing chapter of the first volume of his book, The History of Sexuality, talks in broad terms about how power was traditionally exercised by the state through what he terms deduction, which is the threat to take something away, whether it's life, goods, money, labor, freedom. In the early modern period, Foucault characterizes the shift in government from being a deductor to being administrators of life. This is accompanied by two complementary shifts in how people are understood in general. There is a fresh focus on what anybody can do, be, or become. At the same time, there's an understanding of the mechanics of humanity, or how we work as a class of beings. You'll notice that this sets up a binary between definitions of person versus people. During this time period, institutions like colleges or the military developed to impose order on bodies, to make them understood in certain ways as constituents and contributors to something larger than themselves. All of this culminates in the key example at the heart of Foucault's study, an ordering that imposed specific understandings on sexuality within society in the 19th century. In the larger work, Foucault is explicit in describing the situation. He describes how in the 17th and 18th centuries, literature was, if anything, ridiculously straightforward in addressing sex. The topic is taken as a given that any reader would recognize the facts of life. Then, suddenly, in the 19th century, you can see a total shift. Now there's a motion to apply a scientific or medical standard to the topic. And Foucault notes that this shift is accompanied by a shift in cultural practice, where it becomes paramount to use this information to implement the correct, mind that word, correct sexual development of children. In short, parents are encouraged through copious medical literature to take overt steps to prevent children from masturbating, and thus prematurely initiating sexual maturity and damaging themselves, thereby ending human society. And that's how the medical literature of the time basically presented it to people, that this was an obligation that they had to the future history of mankind. Well, they would say mankind. What is the result of this change? Within the household, parents arrange their activities in order to intercept and prevent normal sexual exploration. These activities serve to alert the children about how their parents feel about the subject of sex, and knowing that the parents object, the children, who are brilliant, adaptive, social creatures, take care to make sure that their parents do not catch on to the fact that they continue to masturbate. They police their activities to remain under the radar, engaging in a farcical dance of acknowledging the household law while still continuing to do what they want, what is essentially normal. The parents, being likewise brilliant, adaptive, social creatures with a much wider range of personal experiences than their children, must also realize, if they are, honest with themselves, that the masturbation has simply gone underground. The fact that it has, however, satisfies the letter of the law. So what Foucault sees going on in this scenario is an exercise in the power of authority and how the individual learns to deal with it. So, importantly, for gender studies, this example of ridiculous pseudo-medical history demonstrates the pattern for so-called aberrant sexuality of all kinds in the Western tradition for much of the last century. As long as it remained out of sight, it remained acceptable. In the feudal system that Foucault begins with, transgressions of civil or canonical law are coded as unique acts. If you had sex with a goat, then you, and often the goat, were guilty of breaking the law and would be subject to punishment. You would not, however, be classified as a zoophile. With the introduction of the medical scientific element of the 19th century, the primary motivation shifted from dealing with the crime committed to dealing with the person who committed it, to addressing how to alter his or her behavior to put it in line with the expected norms of society. So we wind up with a situation where people are expected to conform to a standard and change who they are. More, they are expected to do this on their own as a response to the demands of normality as the unspoken law. So, within Marxist terms, what Foucault describes, they would call the social hegemony, the tacit enforcement of rules by the majority upon any minority. From a Marxist perspective, we can see a firm embodiment of what Benjamin talks about in the subtextual ideology of Foucault. Clearly, he believes with all his heart that what we are today derives from the history of our past. And by history, he means the social interactions of people in matters that are far from the traditional ideas of marking who was king and when this battle was fought on a certain, on what date. Our readings for this week are from two giants of the early 20th century, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. You're to apply some serious Marxist thought to these works and see what you come up with. I hope you enjoy doing so. Let me know if you need any help.